And so a few weeks ago, Matthew asked about Kundalini in Los Angeles, which has been a sort of mecca for this lifestyle. And while I cannot profess to understand the culture deeply, a number of my friends teach it here, and I know even more people who practice it. And two common threads are that a lot of actors and entertainers love the rigors of the practice, and it also appeals to former drug addicts. Now, there's this idea that's been explored by scholars like Wendy Doninger that the Kriyas, those cleansing exercises that comprise the Kundalini canon, were developed in India when supplies of soma, or psychedelic mushroom tea, became scarce. And I know that that's still up for debate, but it's pretty solid that there was some psychedelic juice going on in there. So when reading the literature, soma devotees were flying through the universe, and when the soma disappears in the texts, they continue to fly only through intense breathing exercises, using their physiology to provide the psychedelic experience that can no longer be achieved through external means. Now, again, it's only a theory, but there is something there, and we've seen it in other cultures outside of India as well. So it also makes sense that former drug addicts would seek out a practice that provides them with a similar form of euphoria. And that is not a criticism at all. My old friend, the deceased DJ Chebi Sabah, once told me while we were on tour together, everyone is addicted to something. Better yoga than crack.
Derek, what do you think specifically was so exhilarating about Kundalini Yoga for you when you first bumped into it?
The effects on my nervous system. There was nothing that I did. I mean, when you wave your hands for an hour while you're chanting in a group environment, it's the adrenaline rush. I truly get it, because for hours afterwards, I would feel like I was buzzing.
Do you think you're also, putting yourself into a kind of trance-induced altered state through all of that repetitive movement and breath, such that, it's just, you're just in a different place than you were when you started?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I always thought of it as like the Gnawa rituals in Morocco, where they play overnight.
Yeah.
And the music is going, and it's for the dancer to facilitate trance. And it's the repetition of the music combined with the consistent movement that creates the trance states where people completely lose control of identity. And, we can talk about what they're channeling, as we've talked about before, but it is that physiological state of repetition that gets them focused and put into a flow state, basically.
Yeah. And as you were saying last time, right, that what we know about psychedelics is it's actually the decrease in activity in certain brain regions that start to create that for some people, right, people who are predisposed, I would include myself in that group, the wonderful sense of disorientation and losing boundaries on sense of self, on, body maps, on, where your mind would normally get fixated into this more sort of expansive, trippy state.
Was there also, Derek, a sense of contact high, that you were sort of making, eye contact and emotional contact with the people around you, and that there was a feedback loop in the room?
I wouldn't say eye contact. I've done yoga practices where you've sat across from someone and stared into their eyes for long periods. And I never liked that. That was one mode that I just didn't get it. It didn't hit me in that way. But being around people, one example too, is I used to DJ something called trance dances where everyone would be blindfolded, and I've taken them, I've been in them, and I've also DJ'd them. And there is something called, first of all, group flow, which I've mentioned before, which is people's, their brain waves synchronize, and it usually has to do with music. And musicians performing together, this happens to, and it's a well-studied phenomenon. And it also happens in groups where everything syncs and you feel a part of that. So on that level, I definitely felt a part of people. And when you loosen the strictures of your ego, and you're able to not worry about what you look like, what you're wearing, all of those things, it's a very moving experience.
Well, and this is what's so powerful about ecstatic dance. And these are the moments I know you relate, where as a DJ, you really feel like something is clicking, right? Where the whole room just goes into that entrained sort of place. But I wanted to come back to what you said about the, perhaps the origins in terms of the yogic history. I've seen both in Feuerstein, and then is it Philip Ott who wrote Persephone's Quest? Oh, okay. I feel like there's several reference points for this idea that that soma was coming from the Amanita muscaria mushroom, and that as the Aryan invaders came in, the people who were writing these yogic texts and engaging in these practices had to sort of move further south, away from the areas where the mushroom grew, and so had to experiment with other ways of getting high.
Exactly. They moved away from the areas, and they also developed, this was the Harappan civilization. So they started moving into cities, whereas they were much more in the country. I mean, compared to our cities, it's much different, but yes, exactly. They were away from those areas.
I wanted to bring up this anecdotal relationship between Kundalini yoga practice and communities and folks with addiction histories. I find that pretty interesting. The same thing is said about and within the Ashtanga yoga community. And sometimes it's said with a note of pride that, I've transitioned from an impure obsession to something that's, quite functional and it's adaptive. But I always wonder whether we are seeing a correlation between physical intensity in practice, the peak experiences that intensity generates, and addiction cycles themselves, that there seems to be like a wheel there that's rolling and rolling.
First off, my feeling on addiction is if you're addicted to something that is harming you and harming your family and community, and you can move to something that's better, go for it. Like, I'm all for any sort of intervention that works. That's why, I'm big on psychedelic therapy, for example, that could help with that. I'm huge on that. But I have noticed in some people who I know who have been addicted, the momentum with which they embrace their new addiction can be equally debilitating in different ways.
And is there a way, Matthew, in which perhaps we can see practices that do put people into powerful altered states and that can have can mimic other kinds of addictive processes, are then sort of very fertile ground for cultish manipulation?